Hello, and welcome to our PowerPoint module for this week. And we're going to devote the entire week to the process of developing a research proposal. So I hope that this will be helpful in potentially rethinking your research questions or getting more specific with your research topic or questions. I also hope that this will be helpful in thinking about the next step, which is developing the literature review. So we're going to cover several different topics relating to the process of developing that research proposal. Here are our more specific objectives for this week. So first, we're going to describe different types of research questions. I know you've already completed the research question assignment, so this will be an opportunity to review what you have, potentially tweak what you have if you think you can fit it better into a particular type of research question. And we're going to be workshopping and discussing your proposed research questions as well. We'll do this in class. We're also going to introduce how to conduct a literature review. This is going to be done both in the module and in class. And then finally, we're going to discuss ethics in social research, because this is an important component of developing a research proposal. You need to demonstrate in your proposal that the research you are planning is following core ethical principles in social research. So that's what we're going to do for this week. I expect this will take about an hour to complete, maybe a little bit less. Here are your deliverables for this week. There are 4 questions for you to respond to in the PowerPoint module. In addition, you do have an exam due on Friday. So this is exam 1. It's due on Inquire, so I will create a link for you to submit the exam on Inquire. I will post this exam by Tuesday night, and that way you will have several days to complete it. It's open book, open notes, but there are certain ethical principles that you need to follow, and that is not working with anyone else in class, not sharing work with other members of the class, and not discussing the exam with anybody else other than me if you have questions as you are completing it. Okay, but that exam is going to be due on Inquire Friday night, and we'll talk more about the procedure of doing the exam and submitting the exam in class. So let's start with an opening question. And your question is this: what are the qualities of a good research question? Consider the ways in which the research question or questions you plan to pursue for your proposal align with these qualities. So you can pause the PowerPoint module here and answer this opening question, then return to the module for the rest. Now that you've answered that opening question, let's start to go over what makes a good research question. And I'm sure many of you had something along these lines in your responses. A good research question is clear, right? We know exactly what kinds of relationships, what kinds of question you are seeking to answer. It should be something that is answerable, right? You don't want to have a research question that is so general that you really can't answer it within a research project. You also want a research question that is researchable or researchable, meaning that you are able to answer this question through research, through your research project. And it should also be researchable in the sense that you should be able to develop a literature review on this topic. So there should be some literature on the overall topic that you're covering. It should be connected to theory and research, meaning that, and this is connected to that researchable bullet point, you should be able to find relevant research on this topic, not the exact project you're planning, but still within the topic. And you should be able to connect what you're doing to a theoretical perspective, as we discussed in previous weeks in this class. If you're using more than one research question, these should be tied to one another, right? You don't want to have 2 or 3 unrelated questions to answer. Ideally, if you have multiple questions, they build upon one another. You also want to have a question that perhaps hasn't been asked, at least not in the exact same way that you are going to be asking it. So it should be something original. You don't want to repeat something that someone else has done. You want to do something novel. And then finally, and this is actually where some students find that their research questions are not great for the course. Your research question in this sociology course should be about a social science topic or issue. Okay, so make sure that you are applying sociological concepts, or I know we have public health folks, some concepts or ideas in public health. It shouldn't be something within the field of psychology, for example, right? So this is an incomplete list of what makes a good research question, but I do want you to consider these as you look at the questions that you wrote for your research question assignment last week. Now, in addition to thinking about what makes a good research question, we can also distinguish between different types of research questions. This was in the additional reading outside of the textbook that you did for this week. And you saw 3 different types of research questions defined and described. The first is descriptive, and a descriptive research question is really just about typically describing a single variable or a single concept. So you might start a descriptive research question with how many or how often. Descriptive research questions tend to be not necessarily the most interesting sociologically because you aren't thinking about, say, differences, or you aren't trying to identify say, relationships between different variables, right? So descriptive questions maybe aren't the most interesting, but you probably will have some kind of a descriptive question you answer in your proposed research. It might just be the first step of several different questions. Now that brings us to the latter two, comparative and relationship questions. And these are ones that you see more typically in social science and in sociology, and tend to lead to more interesting research projects. So a comparative question, you might start with, what is the difference between, or what is the difference in? And you're comparing different groups. So perhaps we want to look at gender differences in some outcome, or we want to look at racial differences, age differences. You can think about different demographic categories that might make sense here. A relationship question is a bit different from a comparative question because now we're looking at the relationship between two concepts. So instead of saying, well, how does this one thing operate differently across different groups, now we're asking, how does this one concept, which we're going to operationalize into a variable, how does this correspond with or correlate with some other concept that we're turning into a variable? This is probably, one of the most common ways to think about quantitative social science research. We could think about the relationship between socioeconomic status and cardiovascular disease. I think I use that example a lot, but it does overlap with sociology and public health, so it seems appropriate. That would be a relationship question. Now maybe we want to combine our relationship question with a comparative question. So what is the relationship between socioeconomic status and cardiovascular disease, and how does this relationship differ by race? There we have a relationship question coupled with a comparative question. So you can combine these in interesting ways to develop unique research questions for your own projects. Now let's follow up that discussion of different types of research questions with a content question. So I want you to answer the following question on Inquire. Which type or types of research questions, descriptive, comparative, or relationship, best align with your topic? And you can go back and review the research question or questions that you have and try to categorize those. Or if you plan to make some adjustments, let's say you want to, or you think that a relationship question would make the most sense for your topic, rather than a descriptive question that you already have, you can make some adjustments here, right? I also want to note here that your topic might align with more than one type of research question, right? So in the previous slide, I had the example of looking at socioeconomic status, cardiovascular disease, and race differences. And so that's combining a comparative and a relationship question. Perhaps you have something like that as well. So you can pause, answer this content question, and then return to the PowerPoint module when you're done. Let's shift gears now and talk about the literature review. And this is your next proposal assignment, conducting a literature review. So that's one of the reasons why we're going to start talking about this now. I want to start by thinking more broadly about the purpose of the literature review. Why do you do one? And why is this such a crucial component of the research process? Well, the first reason, or the first purpose, is to identify how your research topic aligns with existing research. You might not have a lot of reading or background knowledge on the topic that you plan to study, and that's okay. The literature review is there to familiarize you with the existing research and also to set you up to be able to articulate how your research topic aligns with research that already exists. Another purpose of the literature review, and you see this commonly in the write-up of the actual lit review, is to identify gaps in existing research that you plan to address in your research. So this can be a good way to actually refine your research questions by saying, okay, well, in the previous research, the literature that you've read, people have done this, this, and this, but they haven't done this particular thing in relation to your topic. The third purpose of a literature review is to evaluate the strengths and limitations of existing research. This kind of plays into the gaps as well, right? Because perhaps you do find some research on your topic, but it's lacking in some conceptualization or methodology that you are going to bring to this topic. So a big part of the literature review is evaluation. It's not just a summary of what's out there. It's supposed to be analytic in that you are evaluating and critiquing the research that already exists on this topic. Okay? There are also several different ways to format a literature review. So there isn't necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach to developing a lit review, but there are a few common ones. So we're going to go through a few common structures of lit reviews, and you might find that one structure or format fits better for the purpose of your research than another, and that's to be expected. So one way of writing a literature review is to present the literature in chronological order. And this would be considering the early concepts or themes or ideas that are in the literature on the topic you're studying, and then how these ideas have evolved across time. And this might be a more useful approach if you are studying something that is, say, relatively recent in its development, or if you're studying a topic that does have a long history in the field, but the concepts, the ideas, the theories that have been used as a frame to study it have changed across time. Now, chronological literature reviews are not especially common in a research proposal like the one that you're doing, but there may be scenarios where it does make sense to take a more chronological stance or take a chronological approach to review your literature. The more common, and the one that I see more often in students' research proposals, is a thematic lit review. And there are several ways to do this. This is not a complete list, but these are several common ways in which you see people conduct thematic lit reviews. You might organize your literature by concepts and themes that you're going to incorporate in your research. And there's an easy way to get started in thinking about this type of thematic lit review. Take a look at your research questions and what concepts can you pull out of those questions. Perhaps you would have a section of your lit review on one concept, and then you would have a section on another concept you're covering, And then maybe you'd have a third section that talks about how these concepts might correspond with one another. So that's one example of how you could do this. We also sometimes see literature reviews organized like a funnel, right? And you've probably, in learning the writing process at some point have heard of this kind of funnel analogy where you start with the broadest concepts on your topic and then you get more specific as the lit review progresses. For example, if I'm looking, let me return to that question of socioeconomic status and cardiovascular disease. Maybe I'm going to start by thinking about SES more broadly and how it's related to health. And then maybe I'm going to get more specific. Perhaps my measure of SES that I plan to use is household income. So then I'll talk about household income in particular as a determinant of health. And then I'll get more specific and talk about income as a determinant of cardiovascular disease. And then I can get even more specific and start to bring race into the discussion as well. So the funnel approach is also a common one that you see, and it does also overlap a bit with that first one, right? You're still organizing the literature by concepts and themes, you're just starting broad and then getting more specific. Now the last one is to organize literature by contrasting theories or ideas in the field. So you would set this up in a slightly different way. Perhaps you'd have one section of your lit review on, one theoretical perspective that's really prevalent in the literature on your topic. And then there's a contradictory or contrasting theory, and that's going to be the second section. You're going to say, however, other scholars say this. And then you might actually set up your hypotheses to test which of these theories or perspectives makes is confirmed by your analysis and by your study. So you could say, well, we have these two conflicting theories, these two conflicting perspectives. I think that I'm going to see this pattern and here's why. So it is a, some say, others say, I say way of setting it up. This would be useful if you are in the literature identifying very different frameworks or very different ways of viewing the topic that you're studying. And then it would be useful perhaps to pit these ideas against each other in your lit review. Now there are other ways of doing a thematic lit review. These are just a few examples. Perhaps you're going to have some combination of these in your lit review. Now, regardless of the type of lit review format that you choose to follow for your proposal, I want to point out that a lit review is not an annotated bibliography. Some of the weaker lit reviews that students write in a course like this are ones that are organized like an annotated bibliography, meaning that, as you see in the figure that I created, you have each paragraph of your lit review organized by source. So you start with source 1 and you summarize the source and you explain its relevance to your topic. And then your next paragraph is source 2. Do the same thing. And then the next paragraph is source 3. So an annotated bibliography is organized by source, right? A literature review should be organized by theme, concept, or idea. So a literature review, let's say we take an annotated bibliography with 5 sources and we convert it into a literature review. Perhaps our first body paragraph, as shown in the figure, will be about the first theme, concept, or idea that we're covering. And then we're going to use source 1 and 3 as evidence or support for this theme. Okay, so we're integrating sources into our body paragraphs based on how they may support a common theme or idea. Then our second body paragraph might incorporate sources 2, 3, and 5, for example. And so we're going to bring those in as evidence or support for the second theme, concept, or idea we're covering in our lit review. And then the third body paragraph does the same thing. Here we have a separate theme, concept, or idea, and we're using sources 4 and 5 as evidence. So you see here that we're not organizing our paragraphs by source, we're organizing them by idea. And we are kind of just mixing together different sources that provide evidence for that portion of our lit review, for that concept, for that topic. And you can use the same, and you probably will use some of the same sources more than once in your lit review. One thing to look out for, let's say you have your first draft of your lit review, or you've written a paragraph of it. Are you citing the same source over and over again without considering perspectives from or findings from other sources as well, right? So you should be combining the sources that you use to demonstrate whatever theme, concept, or idea you're covering for a particular paragraph or a particular section of your lit review. Now here's a video question relating to the literature review and what the purpose of the lit review is. Some of this is going to be review of what I said in the past few slides, but I do think that Pat Norman, who I've used a few videos from him, I think that he does a good job of providing an overview of what the lit review is for and ways you could organize it. So watch the video by Pat Norman and then answer this video question. What is a laundry list literature review? And you'll get that definition in the video. What steps will you take to avoid creating a laundry list literature review? Okay, and you can think about how this relates to the distinction between an annotated bibliography and a lit review. Okay, so you can pause here, answer this video question, and then come back for the rest. The last topic that I want to cover in our PowerPoint module for this week is research ethics. And the core questions that we ask ourselves as we're planning a research project are, how should we treat the people on whom we conduct research? And what are activities that we should or should not engage in when conducting research? I know that these are very broad, but I do think that we would come up with a pretty common, well agreed upon list of the way we should treat people in our research, so our research participants, and what we should and shouldn't do, right? So we don't want to inflict any harm on our research participants, and this includes physical harm, this includes psychological harm, such as damaging self-esteem or causing stress. This includes economic harm, so perhaps hurting the career prospects or employment opportunities of our participants. We don't want to break confidentiality, as it could lead to all forms of harm, or reveal the identities of our participants. So these are important components of thinking about research ethics in your own projects. Are there activities that we should or should not engage in? I think that these are going to be very much connected to how we think we should treat people in our research, right? Do we ensure that privacy is not invaded? Do we ensure that we aren't being deceptive or lying to our participants? And it may seem that these ideas of no harm, protecting confidentiality and not revealing our participants' identities, that these would be easy to do. And in some ways they are. But there is a lot more nuance to thinking about ethics in social research, as we'll discuss more in class. Okay? So I'm going to leave it here in introducing the fundamental questions that we ask. And we're going to break these down a little bit more when we get to class. There are still a couple more slides on research ethics, but this is as far as we're going to go in thinking about these broad questions. Now, there are several perspectives that we can utilize to better understand what is ethical in social research. So these do start to break down those questions that I posed on the previous slide. Perhaps we think that there are absolute rules about what is okay and what is not okay as a researcher, right? It doesn't matter what the circumstances, doesn't matter what the research project is about, but there are some hard and fast rules that we can apply to all social research. And that's what we would call universalism, right? That there's a universal set of rules and we can apply them to every kind of research project. On the other hand, we have situation ethics, which is kind of the opposite of universalism. Here we're saying that we need to assess research projects on a case-by-case basis. We need to look at each project on its own, consider the benefits of doing that research for society, for science, and weigh that against the potential consequences, right? What are the potential risks for participants? What kind of harm could come to participants? We need to look at that situationally instead of having those universal rules. Third, we might think that ethical transgression is pervasive in research. Every research project has some ethically questionable practice or practices. And it's the role of, thinking about research ethics, we need to do that in order to try to mitigate those kinds of questionable practices or justify potentially questionable practices by saying, this is what we're doing to minimize the risk to participants. So this is a somewhat different perspective, that no matter what research we're doing, there's some risk for participants. There's something that is ethically questionable. And then finally, this is a little bit different, but perhaps we want to consider whether certain acts are wrong in and of themselves, regardless of the outcome, or maybe we're going to focus more on the consequences, and we think those matter in deciding whether something is right or wrong. This contrast is comparing deontological and consequentialist ethics. It's taking a somewhat different frame or set of frames to try to understand what ethical practice and behavior is. I know we're staying very conceptual here, but we're going to discuss some examples and discuss how in our actual research ethics process that we have in the US, called the Institutional Review Board, how it applies each of these theoretical perspectives. So we'll do more of that in class this week. So I just mentioned the Institutional Review Board in the previous slide. And this is how research ethics are monitored and regulated in the US. I know your textbook is British, so it has an example of how ethics are monitored and regulated in the UK. We're going to be talking about the US. The Institutional Review Board is also known as the IRB. And the first IRBs were established as recently as the 1970s, actually. And it isn't that there was no concern or, no research ethics practices before then, but it wasn't as established or institutionalized at the time, not until the 70s. And the reason why the IRBs first emerged was the horrific violations in research ethics that we were seeing at the time. Many of you have probably heard of the Tuskegee syphilis study. This was in the 1970s. It was supported by the US government and left about 300 Black men untreated for syphilis, even after antibiotics were available. So we can see how this is a clear violation of research ethics. And it was in response to studies such as these that we get the IRBs that we have today. IRB oversight does not include consideration of your research project or the strength of your actual research project. The IRB is not going to evaluate whether or not you ask good research questions, or they're not going to evaluate whether or not your research methods align with those questions, for example. The IRB is primarily and fundamentally concerned with how human or animal subjects are being used in research. If you're using some kind of deception, why are you doing that? Are there potential risks to participants, whether that's physical, psychological, or economic harm? This is what the IRB is concerned with. And when planning a research project, this is important. Your application to the IRB must be submitted and approved by the IRB before you begin collecting data, right? You cannot begin your research project until you have that IRB approval. Roanoke College has an IRB. I will, in a moment, show you an example or show you the actual application for the IRB at Roanoke College. And there's also a website you can go to look at what the practices and procedures are for our IRB, okay? So now I want you to actually open the Roanoke College IRB application form. I have added this to Inquire so you can, just like for a video question, you can open it and review it. Once you have perused the IRB application form, I want you to answer the following content question on Inquire. Briefly describe how the Roanoke College IRB addresses each of the following ethical issues in the application form. So identify where these are addressed, how they're addressed. Harm to participants, informed consent, privacy, and deception. So there are a number of items, a number of questions that are posed in the IRB form that address these different components of research ethics. So what I want you to do is pause here, answer this content question on Inquire, and then come back for the final slide. That concludes your PowerPoint module for this week. I do want to remind you of a few things that are coming up. First, Exam 1 is due on Inquire this Friday. I am going to post it on Inquire Tuesday evening. I will send you an email when it's posted so you know it's there. And you have until Friday at 11:59 p.m. to submit it, right? So you have several days. It's open book, open notes. Your readings for next week are Bryman chapters 7 and 8. And then you do have a Vox article, and this is covering a topic that we've already discussed a bit, right? Failure to replicate studies and why we see this. And then you also have two other articles. One is the Crowther and colleagues article, Analysis of the National Childhood Obesity Database. This is a British study, and they did have some problems with sampling that you're going to read about. I do want you to just skim this. I know it's at least 20 pages, but do skim it just to get a sense of what issues they did run into with sampling for this study. And then you also have an article that comments on the Crowther study. It's nicely titled, Fat Children Dodge the Scales in a Survey of National Obesity. Not the kindest title, I'll admit, but it does talk about the National Childhood Obesity Database. So this is your final reading for the week. You don't have any assignments due next Friday, all right? So you'll get a little bit of a reprieve after submitting your research question and also submitting your exam, okay? So that's all I have for you. I will see you in class this week.